Well, let me tell you something, podcast people. If you haven't been able to figure it out by the way I'm cutting this promo on you, Jack, today's show is all about the weird, wacky, wild world of professional wrestling, brother. And let me tell you something else. We're going to take you all through our personal journeys, how we got into wrestling, from the 80s through the 90s, the Monday Night Wars, what our favorite time was, all the way up to All In this past September 1st. A game-changing event in the world of wrestling. So without further ado, let's get ready to rumble. Today on the N.E.R.D.Bomber podcast. Hi, I'm your friend Claude.
And I am just Jamie.
And today on the N.E.R.D.Bomber podcast, we're going to talk about wrestling. And we're going to do it for the whole show this time.
Ooh, yeah!
Woo! That actually kind of sounds like modern day Ric Flair. Yeah, we've kind of broached the subject in previous episodes. Probably most extensively in our WrestleMania review. However, this time we're going to talk some general wrestling, kind of talk about our personal histories with it, our likes and maybe dislikes, and picks for our favorites, and kind of give you our background with the Sport of Kings.
So, when you're a kid, and especially at the time that we were kids, experiencing wrestling was a little bit different because there were these big stars, but you really never actually got to see them wrestle.
Right.
The only TV shows were sort of like these Saturday and Sunday shows.
Welcome to the Superstars of Wrestling. I'm Vince McMahon along with Jesse the Body Ventura. We will have stars, plenty of them this week on the Superstars of Wrestling.
And that would usually be like the second and third tier wrestlers beating jobbers.
Yep.
So you never really got to see like real competition. You'd see like these 3-minute, squash matches. And then if you were lucky, you'd see highlights from the bigger shows. So you might see a little bit of Hulk Hogan or Randy Savage or Roddy Piper or these kind of guys. So it was more sort of, maybe it's also because, you're a child, but it's more like mythological almost.
Right.
Like these mighty godlike men, that you knew could do these amazing things, but you only got to see little snippets of it.
So big, so oily. But yeah, it was also the smack dab in the era of the rock and wrestling kind of boom, or at least the tail end of it. I remember having the Hulk Hogan cartoon on Saturday mornings. And
all right, good morning again, wrestling fans. And Hulk Hogan, I've got to ask you, how are you doing today?
Mean Gene, I gotta tell you, I'm really pumped up for today's show, man. See, first, me and my pals form a rock band and get challenged by Rowdy Piper and his band of turkeys. It gets me wild, man. Then us wrestlers have an awesome adventure when our plane crashes in the middle of the Amazon jungle.
I understand, Hulk, you encounter some tough Amazon women.
Man, you won't believe how tough they are. And then, man, Wendy Richter talks the Hulkster and some of my buddies into taking this heavy-duty art class.
Hulk, this is a whole new you. Fans, I never thought it could happen. The Hulkster in an art class. This I've got to see.
It's worth watching, so stay tuned.
you see him in that form. You see him on the A-Team. You see him in snippets on the Saturday recap shows. And you see him, advertise for No Holds Barred and, movies. And it's all these areas at once. And, it's nothing like, someone like The Rock has today or even their current stars. You have multi-platform media exposure. But back then, it was like, wait, this is all the same guy? In all these areas. And then obviously, I had like a little thumb wrestler of Hulk Hogan design.
I had the same. I had the same thing, yep.
So it's like this one guy he's all these things?
Yeah, and so it's almost like the lack of exposure is what built up his
yeah.
Not so much reputation, but the what's the word I'm looking for?
Mystique?
Mystique, yes,
mythology?
exactly. No, that's it. Yeah, that totally fits the bill. he had this sort of, he was larger than life. Part of the reason why is because you only saw little samples of these amazing things that he would do.
Right.
And you never really got that full exposure. And the big thing with wrestling, of course, back then is that you didn't really get a taste of these people as real people.
Yeah, definitely.
They were in kayfabe all or most of the time up through the 80s at least.
Yeah.
And so all you knew them for was their wrestling personalities.
Yes. Well, yeah. Anytime they were on any of these other forms of media, they were always in character, even, talk shows, whatever.
Which is so weird to go back and watch now.
Yeah.
Randy Savage on Arsenio, and he's out there in his gear, his wrestling gear.
Right.
And doing the whole shtick, doing his whole character. And it's just fascinating.
He's mean, he's macho, he's here. Macho Man Randy Savage.
Have a seat, sir.
I'll sit right here.
Okay, that's fine with me.
I'm the tower of power, too sweet to be sour. I'm funky like a monkey. Sky's the limit and space is the place.
Hello.
And now, like, if a wrestler appears on a talk show or on a sports show, they're usually, they're an entertainer, they're a performer. They don't really talk about it in terms of like they're in this character.
Right.
Every once in a while, though, they'll try to do it, and then it just comes off weird and awkward because you've seen it go both ways.
Yeah.
So, like, I saw, Paul White, the Big Show, was on a late night talk show. I can't remember which one. And was talking like, he had a real disagreement with his opponent, whoever it was, and he really had to, he's going to show him, going to show him the deal,
right.
Show him, who's boss or whatever. It's like that comes off a little cringy when you've already let the cat out of the bag, like we all know that you guys are buddies or whatever. So it's a tough balancing act that wrestling is trying to follow right now. Every year coming up to WrestleMania, like, some of the wrestlers, the headliners, the big names or whatever, will do the rounds through like ESPN.
Right.
So they'll be showing up on like ESPN radio programs, and yeah, they're kind of like in this halvesies character where they're kind of in character, but it's also the real world, so they dial it back. It's kind of very strange.
Yeah.
And the wrestlers' social media can be strange too.
Oh, yeah.
Because some of them have a very kayfabe social media presence. That their Instagram page is their character.
Right.
But other people, it's like their normal lives. And so that's a tough balance. And I don't know how much control sort of WWE has over their social media platforms.
Right.
I know, Braun Strowman, who's one of the big names right now.
Yeah.
He's got an Instagram page under his real name, Adam Scher. And it even says, like, this is my personal page, not my TV character or whatever.
Right.
And most of the time it's just him, like, hunting or petting a dog or working out or whatever it is. Every once in a while there will be, like, an in-character post, though. So it's very strange.
Yeah, where do you, just for curiosity's sake, what's your personal opinion on where does it fall on that issue?
Well, it's just we're way too in the weeds on it right now. Like, you can't get it back, At this point, I feel like as a fan, you have to treat it like you treat any other form of fictitious entertainment. Mm-hmm. So that's what it is. These are performers, and they're in character. And you can cheer and boo. It's interactive. That's fine.
Right.
It doesn't, I just think that you can't bring it back. You can't make me really love or hate somebody based on the actions that they're taking as a character. Mm. You can like or dislike them based on what you think of their personality or their performance.
Yeah.
But, somebody cheats in a match. I'm going to be, oh, that son of a bitch cheated. You know what I mean?
Well,
like
that's for that, yeah.
The horse is out of the barn, as some of the wrestling people like to say, and you can't get it back.
Do you think that they, as far as social media goes, do you think they should have to keep up the kayfabe, or how should they approach that? Because I kind of feel strongly that they should, or at least, obviously they can't be told they can't have a personal account, but in that case, I think there should be two.
Right, a personal page that's private, that's for their family and friends and whatever, and then Adam Scher can have his page, and then he has another one that's, Braun Strowman WWE.
Yeah.
And that's his character page.
Yeah.
I think that's fair.
And they're, like, kind of contractually bound to sort of, make that the character's page.
Yeah, I think that's fair. Or even if it's, maybe that would get a little awkward, but if that page is even run by the company. Yeah. It's just a character it's writing. Right. It's not really their selves. So I don't know. That's, again, it's all tricky.
I wonder what would happen if we were able to go back in time and introduce the concept of modern social media to Dr. D. David Schultz right after he got done smacking John Stossel. Or any of those guys from that era, you know?
Yeah, I mean, they were so old school about it, you know? They probably would just be like, I don't need that.
Right.
You know, so it's interesting. If you inserted social media into their lives, they'd probably dismiss it.
Yeah.
But if it had evolved from before that, and, you know, kind of step by step as it has now, and you know, to be a part of the world, then it'd probably be the same as it is now. I mean, not everybody even has social media.
Well, I'm sure it would probably have driven guys like them right out of the business.
Right.
You know, adapt or die, I guess.
I suppose so. Yeah, and I don't know what I would do about it in the present.
Yeah.
I think, you know,
It's
we're in too deep at this
yeah.
point. But anyway, yeah, back in the old days, the mystique was different, especially as a child. And that all changed, you know, in the 90s when you started having primetime wrestling, and all of a sudden the stars were out there.
Yep.
And that was a pretty drastic change because business was down like in the sort of 92 to 95-ish.
Yeah.
And then spiked to legendary, you know, the highest it's ever been in the second half of the 90s. So it was a pretty drastic change.
Yeah, I mean, one end of the decade was extreme in one direction, and the other end of the decade was extreme in the opposite. I never really thought of it in those terms, but
yeah,
you kind of end up taking it for granted when you're living in it. I mean, I remember
absolutely
constantly it was like all these articles about how hot wrestling was, and I mean, everywhere you turn there was something wrestling related. WCW guys were on the cover of TV Guide in the 90s.
Yeah,
like,
yeah.
You know, it was just that was wrestling then, and then now looking back, it's just like, man, what a real unique time that we witnessed kind of firsthand.
It's true.
WCW signed several prominent McMahon stars, including Hulk Hogan and Rowdy Roddy Piper. A no-holds-barred battle erupted.
WCW is Major League Ball right now, and I'm a Major League Ball player.
WCW doesn't have a chance against the World Wrestling Federation.
While Piper points to bigger purses and major names in the Turner League, McMahon's champion, Shawn the Heartbreak Kid Michaels, dismisses their stars, saying even reigning champ Hulk Hogan is past his prime.
At one time, he was a huge name in this business, but as far as being on an athletic level, as far as having skill, he's nowhere in my league.
And last September, the newer league furthered its attack by broadcasting its 2-hour live show against McMahon's 1-hour tape show.
He's splitting the audience and he's saying, hey, look, watch one or the other. And again, in an aspect to not help himself, but hurt us. That's his marketing philosophy.
Quit whining, McMahon, says Turner League exec Eric Bischoff.
Now that they have competition, they're squealing like pigs.
Bischoff says the McMahon's WWF is old and played out, unable to keep up with the drama provided by the newer league, where former good guy Hulk Hogan and his cronies wreak havoc as members of the villainous New World Order to the delight of 20 million cable viewers a week.
It's a Johnny Cash kind of thing. You know, they're kind of like the grunge of wrestling. It's retro wrestling.
But McMahon, outraged over this New World Order's fictitious claim that they were sent from his league to take over the new one, countered with a lawsuit.
He's trying to keep us in court as often as he can, but the reality is that competition is what's made this industry so popular over the past 12 months.
Ratings have gone up, and while at least on Mondays the Turner program is consistently beating McMahon's, both sides seem to be benefiting from the battle. So whichever of these tussling titans wins in the end, wrestling fans are enjoying the fight. And the battle continues. Vince McMahon just expanded his Monday night program from 1 to 2 hours so he can better compete with Turner.
So, you know, you had these two competing properties. You didn't have DVR, so in order to try to get the most out of both of them, you know, I would skip back and forth between Monday Night Raw, WWE, WWF at the time still, and WCW Monday Nitro, the big competing show. And one of my bad habits was I was more interested in in-ring action than I was in promo and story stuff. So I would miss some of those promotional things, backstage things, character interactions, if the other show was showing a match. I don't think that's necessarily always a bad thing, but what happens is I go back and say, why didn't I ever see this cool promo that this wrestler did with this other wrestler? And that's because I probably because it was promo time, and I was like, I'm going to go find something else. I switched back to the other show and watched a match between, like, you know, Funaki and Scotty Too Hottie. And you realize like that kind of stuff was actually probably a bad trend that I would do, or I'd rather watch a match, which isn't, like I said, it's not necessarily a bad thing.
Right.
But depending on who it was, I could have been sort of maybe not prioritizing my viewing quite as well as I should have been.
So it's like whatever came on the screen, you're like, oh, that's just talking. I'm going to go back over here.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So I think a lot of people had that experience. A lot of people talk about switching back and forth. I didn't have cable, and so I didn't have that experience. I was strictly Monday Nitro diehard, and mainly because, I just generally didn't like the WWF approach and product and roster at the time as much. But also, my wrestling viewing depended on getting a VHS tape the next day from somebody else who had cable. So I had to like wait a day and then watch it on Tuesday.
Ah, okay.
And so it was always just taping that one show. I guess I probably could have asked to tape both, but if you think switching channels is bad, try switching VHS tapes. But I think if I had cable, I probably would have done some switching. But I probably would have stuck mainly with WCW.
But so it's interesting because no matter which way you look at it, you're still missing things.
Yeah,
so
absolutely.
You probably feel like going back and looking at it that you miss a lot of whatever cool, interesting things were happening over in WWE. Even though you say you didn't like the product as much, there's still some missed opportunity there.
Yeah, basically ended up being everything that they did and were doing, I had to find out about like after the fact.
Right.
And it was never anything I was aware of in the moment, other than things that were like so big that people were just talking about them at school or whatever, or things that back when WCW had the bad habit of giving away WWF results because they were taped at the time. One of those incidents was notorious, where they gave away that Mick Foley was going to win the belt on Raw in their main event, and actually
doing it as a joke, like.
Yeah, I mean that was the real result, but like doing it just kind of flippantly, trying to make WWF look bad, like, oh well, we already gave their thing away, and like we're gonna make fun of it, but meanwhile, everybody and their brother changed the channel, one to see if it was true and to see it happen,
right?
And that was one of the key things that turned the tide in the Monday Night War against them.
Just this flippant comment, totally worked against their favor. Yeah, so that was my viewing experience in the 90s. Yeah, there were a lot of cool stuff was happening and a lot of stuff that I missed because of the way that I would flip back and forth. And then, like I said before, if you go previous to that, my wrestling experience is more like the aura of wrestling.
Yeah.
Because you missed a lot of the best stuff because they didn't have that on the TV show.
Right.
There was a lot of changes, too, not only like across the TV landscape, but also the way that, by the time you get into the 90s, there's no more wrestling territories.
Right.
You're not talking about, the Midwest territory and Florida.
Yeah.
Florida, whatever it was. Georgia had its own territory, and there was, the AWA and the NWA and all these different things. I mean, it was basically,
Mid-South,
so many. By the early 90s, it was basically WWF at the time, and some sort of like the residue of territories. And the WCW was building at that point.
Yeah.
But, so not only did the landscape changed once WCW actually got a strong TV foothold and started really competing with the WWE around the mid-90s on equal footing. But the presentation, the characters, the storylines changed too. In the early 90s, you still had these cartoon characters, these screaming maniacs, wearing neon and fluorescent colors.
Yep.
And, one guy was the plumber and then the other guy was the electrician character. And then you had the football player and then you had the clown and you had this and that.
Yep.
And then so the popularity changed when that went away, which is in some ways is kind of a bummer because it's kind of because that's the childhood perspective looking back on it, being like, I liked the nonsense.
Yeah.
But, at that time, we were getting to be teenagers, and really it was kind of like the evolution of wrestling at that time followed with our generations,
it's really true,
aging through those sorts of things.
I think that right there is an underrated or underexamined reason why so many fans that were around in the quote-unquote Attitude Era, or during the Monday Night Wars, the 90s basically, are viewed with such, I guess, divisive extremes. And a lot of, like, you go on the Reddit wrestling section, or any Facebook, Twitter, any time that groups of fans post on the internet, when it comes to the fans who were kind of around during that time, they're seen as these, often very kind of, hard-headed, opinionated, kind of stiff group of people that can't accept evolution or anything changing or whatever. But, it's kind of hard to do that, and you can kind of understand when you look at it from that perspective, where during our time, wrestling seemed tailor-made to us. It seemed like it was catering to us.
Even as we changed as people.
Yeah.
When in wrestling in the 80s, this also has to do with the territories were still a thing when we were really little kids.
Right.
And we grew up in the Northeast, which was the WWF.
Yep.
And they had sort of a more cartoony, over-the-top style. So maybe it would be different if we grew up in Tennessee or somewhere else.
Right.
But I still agree with your premise, because when we were kids, we were watching these godlike heroes.
Yep.
When we were sort of like, around 10 or 11, we were watching these cartoon characters. And then when we got to be teenagers, we were watching these, like, badass ass kicker type characters.
Or something more reality-based anyway.
Right, or gritty or dark or emotional or whatever. Yeah. Something that sort of keyed into the development of, a human child's brain through those years.
Right.
It's interesting that the evolution of that followed along with, it would seem to be, that it followed along with our generation.
Yeah, I mean, it worked out that way time-wise, but when that's all and you grew up seeing that happen at every stage, it changes as you change. Once that stops, it can be kind of jarring or difficult, or even for some people impossible to kind of realize that that's never really the way it was, but you had it for so long that you kind of just got used to it.
Yeah. And I think there's also sort of a sense that, at some point the cycle starts to repeat.
Yeah.
And so you get to a certain point, and then the pendulum swings,
yeah.
and you don't go with it, and you're like, there's something about this I don't like.
Right.
Sometimes it's hard to put your finger on it. I mean, that's what happened to me circa probably 2004-ish or something. I didn't watch wrestling for 10 plus years from there until just a few years ago. I kind of have gotten back into it a little bit. And I don't know, I think now I'm kind of more, I understand the business of it, and what's happening in the ring and how they're telling stories and what they're doing physically, and
right.
And so I come at it from a different perspective, and that also comes with maybe just like being an adult and having like a more complex understanding of the world around me, and so I can look at it through a different lens and still appreciate it. When before I was depending on it to interest me in terms of storylines and characters, and now I can, if the storylines and characters are still good, that's great. But I can look at it from a couple different ways and still find satisfaction in the product. That's
almost my exact story, too. I jumped off in 2004, and I got back on in the end of 2014, when it looked like Sting was finally going to come over to the WWE. I think that's around the time that they made the video game with him, and he didn't actually come in until early 2015. And that's what got me back into it, and that's what led to me subscribing to the network and going all in on modern wrestling.
Speaking of all in, it's an interesting development, because for a long time the WWE has effectively had a monopoly on professional wrestling.
Yeah.
Since the downfall of the WCW.
Yeah, 17 years now.
I mean, there's always little companies here and there that try to rise up. TNA gave it their best shot.
Yeah.
They kind of faltered. They're still around as Impact. Ring of Honor is the one most recently that's really trying to make a push to become an important professional wrestling organization, and they are.
They're the only ones that potentially have the resources to even attempt it, because they're owned by the largest owner of TV stations in the country.
Right. And there's been some other things. There's been some lucha stuff on TV. New Japan has a pretty good organization, and they have a good TV show, even though not a lot of people get the channel. It's Access TV. But, I mean, you can sort of go talk about what All In really is and why that makes a difference to sort of the independent wrestling that's not WWE.
Well, in a way, it's kind of a hybrid of all of those things that you just mentioned.
Right.
It's
It's kind of where the all-in thing comes from.
Yeah, talent from each of those organizations.
Well, welcome everybody to WGN America All In 0 Hour. As we see SCU making their way down to the ring. Frankie Kazarian and Scorpio Sky. Tonight, we are part of history. Because tonight, we are all in.
These independent organizations finally sort of joined forces. They did this all-in thing. Like you said, they sold out this big arena, and they put on this show. And it's basically run, essentially, the show was run by, quote, the boys.
Right.
Which is, the wrestling talent. There was no sort of overarching organization. Like you said, this is not a new promotion. And so it's kind of a big deal, and the fans are really behind it. I mean, so that proves that there's a groundswell of support for this sort of thing.
Yeah, it's not, I mean, it's a growing segment of the wrestling talent themselves, as well as a giant segment of the pro wrestling fans that are all at the same time kind of on this path of, I don't want to say building a resentment necessarily, but certainly all feeling the urge and the frustration to move beyond whatever WWE is offering to people.
Just have some variety in life.
Right. I mean, 17 years is a long time for essentially one option to be given you.
And I think it starts to get a little stale. Like I said, you watch the same product for a while, and things start to repeat. The storylines get to repeat. The characters start to repeat. You start to see the patterns. And so you do sort of thirst for something a little different.
And on top of that kind of repetition, all of the presentation that you're being given is produced by the same company, so it's got the same look, it's got the same feel, it's got the same style, it's got the same creative decisions. You're basically that. You go to one company for a product, you know what you're going to get. It's the WWE is no exception. This is the same as going to KFC, and their extra crispy chicken is going to taste the same every time.
That's right. And that doesn't mean that it's bad, by the way, all the time. I mean, there are things in WWE that are good. There are performers that I really like and that do a good job.
Absolutely.
But sometimes you want to see something different.
Yep.
So there was a lot of stuff going on with All In. We don't necessarily have to talk about every match. I mean, get into the minutia. But the one thing that I wanted to focus on first was the Cody Rhodes versus Nick Aldis match.
That's probably the crown jewel on the lineup.
I mean, do you have the results of the show in front of you?
I have. I think so.
I have them here, so we can talk about as many as you want or go through the whole list if you want to.
I think the thing about the Cody and Nick Aldis match, well, there's a couple of notable things about it, but one of the most interesting things about it is, the fact that it was for the NWA World Heavyweight Championship, but given that fact, how early in the show, in the lineup, on the card it was.
Yeah, it was an interesting choice. It really probably should have been the main event, I would think.
Yeah, that's what I expected going all
So,
in.
yeah, the fact that it basically sits at the halfway point of the show was an interesting choice. Especially because it was, the finish is such a big deal. And it was such a sort of seminal point in the show. It's just interesting that they would come away from that sort of, climactic finish and celebration and all that, and then move on to something else.
Yeah.
Especially the next match was kind of not that important, or it didn't have huge names, So it was just an interesting choice that they made. Anyway, Cody Rhodes, who is the brother of Dustin Runnels, which is actually Goldust, and they're both the sons of Dusty Rhodes, which is the famous, the American Dream, Dusty Rhodes. He won the NWA championship belt from Nick Aldis, who's their champion. The NWA used to be a big deal territorial wrestling promotion, and it's, chugging along, still trying to be significant under ownership of
William Patrick Corgan,
otherwise known as Billy Corgan from Smashing Pumpkins.
That's an interesting story in itself, his journey to that.
Yeah, he's earned it, man. He keeps, he's stuck with it in terms of his involvement with wrestling.
Right.
Anyway, Cody Rhodes won it, and they made it feel like a big sporting event, actually.
That's the key, yeah. That's the key about the NWA presentation.
Yeah, and they came down with like these teams of people. So Cody came down with Brandy Rhodes, Diamond Dallas Page, Glacier, and Tommy Dreamer. And Nick Aldis came down with Jeff Jarrett, Sammy Shaw, Sean Devari, and Tim Storm. And so they had these teams with them. And like I said, they made sort of this big point of having this be an NWA world title switch. You know, trying to sort of, really bump the reputation of this title that's kind of, not as big a deal as it used to be. But has quite a legacy behind it.
Right, including, as you said, Cody's father, Dusty Rhodes. That, of course, going into this match was kind of the key piece of this story is, Dusty Rhodes is an industry legend. He passed away in 2014, and here we have, for the first time, in terms of the NWA title, a father held it and a son potentially could hold it. And, obviously, I mean, you kind of have to experience it on two levels as a modern fan. You have to, kind of accept the surface story they're telling, and then also kind of understand what, what they're doing in terms of, like, the show from a behind-the-scenes perspective. So I don't think there was ever any doubt that Cody was going to win this title.
I'm curious what he's going to do with it.
Right, that's the hook.
Is he going to go work NWA shows?
Right.
Is he going to sort of barnstorm around the world? Because Cody Rhodes basically works for every company except for WWE.
Right.
He does New Japan. He does ROH. I guess he hasn't shown up at Impact, but
I think he
may even have, because I know they have Bullet Club members.
It was quick, though, yeah.
But anyway, so it's interesting to see what they're going to do with that. It'd be interesting to see him do sort of an old-school barnstorming tour,
Right.
Go take on everybody's local champion, and et cetera.
Well, so far, that's kind of the approach they've been taking with this new incarnation of the NWA. It's kind of what the previous champion, Nick Aldis, had done, and Tim Storm before him. Just kind of, take the belt, like Ric Flair used to in the heyday, and Dusty Rhodes. They kind of go around, and I don't know if you can consider it an open challenge, but you just sort of show up in promotions across the country.
Right. So before that, there were some other matches. I don't know so much about a lot of what was happening. I mean, Frankie Kazarian is kind of a big deal independent wrestler. He was part of a tag team that defeated the Briscoe brothers, Jay and Mark. The next match was an over-the-top battle royal, and a guy named Flip Gordon won by eliminating Bully Ray. I don't have a full list of the combatants of that battle royal.
Yeah, actually
that would be interesting to look at.
Yeah.
So maybe we'd look that up before we're done talking. So we'll put a pin in the battle royal. Come back to it. Matt Cross defeats Maxwell Jacob Friedman. I'm not familiar with that. The fourth match is something that I actually watched and was really interested in. It was a really good longtime pro wrestler named Christopher Daniels defeated none other than Stephen Amell from the show Arrow. Stephen Amell has been interested in wrestling for a long time. He's done some wrestling, sort of celebrity guest spots. But this was a one-on-one deal. Like, he couldn't hide behind being on a team, just doing one or two things. I mean, he had to wrestle an entire match, put on the show, keep it consistent. And when I watched it, I was super impressed.
Yeah, I mean, they've been doing. They've had Cody and the Young Bucks have a YouTube series, an ongoing series. They've had it for a couple of years now, and it's been being used leading up to the All-In event to kind of hype up the show and, kind of do a little more background on the matches. And there was one in particular that showed, Stephen Amell kind of in training and discussing how he was going to kind of approach it and everything. Both in and out of kayfabe. So, it was kind of interesting on both levels.
I mean, by all accounts, he's really put the work in to be able to do this, because it's one thing for a celebrity wrestler to sort of learn two or three things. But, he did a whole match. He did a lot of the basics. Now, it helps to be in there with a guy like Christopher Daniels, who is a longtime veteran. And if things go south, he can slow it down, reset the match, help, somebody like Amell along.
Right.
But you didn't, when you watched the match, you didn't see that happening. Stephen Amell's green. I mean, there's nothing, you can't get around that. But man, I mean, he was pretty damn convincing. It was probably the best celebrity wrestling I've ever seen.
Yeah, well, I mean,
because other guys, like I said, have done impressive things, but usually it's just like they learn a thing and they do that one thing really good. But he carried an entire match,
right?
And that's the impressive part.
Yeah. You mentioned other celebrity wrestling.
We have Lawrence Taylor,
right?
Did a match against Bam Bam Bigelow. Reggie White had a match.
Oh, that's right.
A lot of athletes. Dennis Rodman and Karl Malone were involved with Hulk Hogan and Diamond Dallas Page in WCW.
Yeah, those are probably the next most impressive.
Yeah. I think the guy that could probably have gotten away with trying to be a pro wrestler of all people was Will Sasso of Mad TV fame. He did some stuff with Bret Hart back in the day.
Yep. You definitely remember that.
Can't think of any others offhand. I mean, some other pro athletes have come into wrestling and really become wrestlers. Steve McMichael from the '85 Bears was a pro wrestler for a long time.
Yep.
Kevin Green would do pro wrestling in his off season. He was a defensive end for the Carolina Panthers in the NFL for a long time, and he would do WCW wrestling like basically full time in the off season.
Yeah, I remember him.
And he would really go out there and do it.
Yeah.
So but in terms of acting, especially a guy like Stephen Amell who doesn't need like pro wrestling money,
right?
He just thinks it's really interesting and he has a passion for it. Enough so that he wasn't happy. He wasn't satisfied with just doing sort of a one-time guest spot in a tag match where he only has to go out and do a couple minutes. Like he actually wanted to show more than that. So,
yeah.
Like I said, I was just...
This is actually his third pro wrestling match.
Right. But again, the first one that was a one-on-one match where he has to do more than just get like a hot tag.
Right, yeah, the first one where it's kind of, incumbent upon him to participate in the entirety of the match.
Right. So next down the list was a women's match. It was a four-way. Tessa Blanchard, who apparently came down with Magnum TA and Tully Blanchard. You don't hear the name Magnum TA very often anymore. She defeated Chelsea Green, Madison Rayne, and Britt Baker in a four-corner survival match. And Tessa Blanchard, kind of like Cody Rhodes, kind of appears everywhere,
right? Except
WWE. Although you said, and I didn't know this, that she had made NXT appearances, which is kind of like the developmental program for WWE.
Yep, she's been in there several times.
I mean, I think she's great. She's clearly ready to do as high level as she wants to.
Yeah, coming out of this show, the talk amongst the established pro wrestling pundits seems to be that she's on the cusp of basically being kind of the face of the women's wrestling industry in the very near future.
Well, she's gonna have to contend with Ronda Rousey,
which
is a whole other separate issue that we probably don't want to get into right now.
Well, I think I'll just say that as long as she stays outside of the purview of the WWE, she could just sort of have kind of a separate reputation or established presence, but also I think when it comes down to it, though Ronda Rousey is clearly the bigger name, the bigger media draw, Tessa Blanchard is a third-generation professional wrestler who has a legacy behind her that Ronda Rousey just does not have.
Right, absolutely, all true. And it remains to be seen how long Ronda Rousey is in this for.
Yeah,
I mean, she's said that she's committed and this is what she's always wanted to do, et cetera, et cetera. But she has a ton of money before she ever got into this business.
Right.
And it's a rough deal to throw yourself on the ground as much as these people do. So we'll see how long she sticks with it. The next match on the card was Hangman Page defeating Joey Janela. I'm not really super familiar with Joey Janela. I've seen a lot of Hangman Page in New Japan, and his work's all right. I have nothing against him, but I didn't really have a lot of interest or engagement in this match.
I heard it was. I saw a clip or two, but I heard it was a pretty brutal, kind of excessively risky match.
I wouldn't be surprised. And I think that's the one that involved the Joey Ryan run-in.
I believe so.
And Joey Ryan is a super controversial wrestling figure. You can get into it if you want to. I don't care for him.
No, I mean, he's divisive, that's for sure. Traditional.
I mean, he's made that work.
Yeah. Traditional-minded fans tend to dislike him, and kind of more casual or more open-minded fans tend to think he's cool.
basically I think he's a smart guy. I think he's entertaining. I think he's a capable wrestler. He's gotten the majority of his recognition and popularity from doing kind of extremely silly matches, most of them intergender matches, most of them involving sexual gimmicks. Chief among them is his use of his penis as a defensive, like, it's almost like his penis is a living element of its own, and it can flip people over, and that's his big move is the dickplex, or is that what it's called?
Whatever it's called, dick flip.
Dick flip, like yeah. And then it involves like a wrestler grabbing his dick and kind of pretending that it's flipping them over, and it's all funny or whatever. Earlier than that, he was kind of known for, like they said, the intergender matches where he would do the boob plex and grab women by their boobs and flip them over their head. I guess it was okay because he would do all these things that would seem on the surface like a type of sexual harassment, but then they would always end up winning the match and getting the better of him.
Right.
There was an angle, I don't know that it was, I think it was outside of anything related to All In. It might have been Lucha Underground, where Joey Ryan was killed in the story, and so the All In was his big
resurrection. Yeah.
So he was escorted to the ring by several men in inflatable penis costumes, and I thought the amusing part of this was the crowd spontaneously chanting "Rest in penis."
Oh my God! I guess Hangman Page had like the boot that killed Joey Ryan in a bag or something like that. It's just ridiculous.
Yeah, I guess at the end of the day, this segment kind of provided that element of like absurdity to really kind of, I guess, provide an all-in show, a complete variety on the show.
True. Yes.
Not that it was necessarily. It was, especially knowing the fact that the show had a very tight deadline and the scheduling, some of it went longer than it should. This was absolutely a segment that could have been cut to kind of ease that burden, but
right.
But it wasn't.
It's also the segment that unfortunately would probably, this is the thing that will prevent, like network TV or whatever from wanting to be involved. Like that's the danger you run into with something like, giant inflatable penises.
Most likely.
So that's kind of another one of the dangers here. Even if, like, from a moral standpoint, it's fine or whatever, even if you find it flat out funny.
Right.
You have to understand, like, that the publicity part of it is not going to be great. The next match was Jay Lethal defeating Flip Gordon. Flip Gordon won the Battle Royal earlier in the night.
Right.
That made him the number one contender for the Ring of Honor Championship. So he got to wrestle Jay Lethal, who is the Ring of Honor champion. Jay Lethal beat him, and Jay Lethal came out with Lanny Poffo, who is Macho Man's brother.
Yep.
And he came out doing a character that he used to do called Black Machismo, which is a goddamn spot-on impression of Macho Man Randy Savage. And Jay Lethal is African-American, which just adds a little layer of comedy to it. And so he came out and doing that character, and he won the match. Jay Lethal's great. I like Jay Lethal.
Yeah, he hadn't been doing the character in a while, and kind of brought it back just for this night, which is cool. He was also somebody who owns the actual jacket that Randy Savage wore in his first WCW appearance, had lent it to Lanny to have Jay Lethal wear in this match. So that jacket he's wearing is actually Randy Savage's jacket.
Yeah, did it actually have like Slim Jim like snap into it or something on the back of it? Like,
yeah.
It might have been one of
from
his
that era.
Actual promotional jackets, because he would wear. He had the Macho Man, of course, had the snap into it promotional deal with Slim Jim,
right?
And they cross-marketed that with his wrestling character on wrestling TV on WCW. So it was an interesting thing that happened in that time. If anybody ever wants to be like superiorly entertained, if that's a word, superiorly, I don't know. If you want to laugh,
supremely, yeah.
Look up Jay Lethal's Ric Flair promo.
Yeah,
it is like the best 8 minutes of wrestling promo I think that exists. Because not only does Jay Lethal do a perfect Macho Man impression, he also does a goddamn perfect Ric Flair impression. And he came out on an episode of, I guess it was TNA, doing the Ric Flair impression to Ric Flair.
Yeah.
And their interactions in that segment of the show it's just some of the best wrestling TV I've ever seen. And even my wife, who's not a wrestling fan, she tolerates it when it's on TV, like was laughing her ass off because it's just the funniest goddamn thing.
It's basically a Ric Flair battle between Jay Lethal as Ric Flair and Ric Flair as Ric Flair.
And it's the craziest version of Ric Flair. It's the Ric Flair that rips his clothes off and elbow drops his jacket.
Totally off the hinges.
And it's just, it is spectacular. So here's where we get to really like sort of, well, except for the Cody Rhodes thing, this is, which should have been among these matches. Here's where we get to the real sort of indie wrestling darlings. First up is Kenny Omega defeating Pentagon. It's written here as Penta L0M.
Yeah, there's so many. He has a bunch of different names.
Yeah.
I know him most as Pentagon Jr.
Yeah, Pentagon Jr.
I guess they have to change it depending on whether it's written or spoken, or I don't know what the thing is.
Probably, which organization he's in. So, anyway, Kenny Omega, I don't think he's ever, maybe as a jobber or something way back. Has he ever done any WWE work?
Yeah, he was in there for a short time, and he was a nobody. Yeah.
Right. So he's like probably the biggest non-WWE wrestler right now in terms of notoriety and sort of being over with the fans.
Yep.
So he had a match against Pentagon Jr., who's a big-time famous luchador, and he wins the match. And I guess the lights go down, the lights come back up, and Pentagon Jr. is standing in the match, runs over and does a move called the Code Breaker, which it's a move, knocks out Kenny Omega. He stands up, takes his mask off, and who is it? None other than Chris Jericho, who did this quick run-in and did it all as a promo because Omega and Jericho are going to have a match on Jericho's cruise.
Yeah, that's
Rockin' Rager or something to that effect.
Yeah, is that next month or is that November? I can't remember.
Coming right up.
Yeah.
So it's kind of crazy for a couple of reasons. One, Jericho had to do red-eye flights to get here just to do this. Hop on a flight to go some other thing and perform with his band Fozzy. He performed this full concert and he still had the Pentagon Jr. face makeup on.
Right.
Which is crazy. The other cool thing about it is that Kenny Omega is the current New Japan World Champion, and Chris Jericho is the New Japan Intercontinental Champion.
Right.
So that's an interesting little tidbit. Their match on the cruise is not going to be a singles match. It's a tag match, I think.
Yeah.
But still kind of cool deal that they had that match. Of course, Kenny Omega is very, very over with the fans. And then the run-in with Jericho, the crowd went nuts.
Well, this also continues their kind of pseudo feud. They actually had a New Japan match, last year? A big match? Or 2 years ago?
No, I think it was this calendar year. It was
okay.
It was this past Wrestle Kingdom.
Yes, there you go. Yep. So I mean, they're telling this extended story, through minimal interaction, but it's probably the most effective one of the most effective current pro wrestling stories or feuds that you're gonna find.
Yep. And like you said, doing it with a minimum of interaction and not being in a hurry about it all the time.
No.
They had their thing, they had their match, however long ago that was, 6 months or more.
Yeah.
And then Jericho kind of did his Fozzy Rockstar thing.
Right.
Then he shows up again in New Japan, has a little rivalry with Naito.
Yep.
Wins the Intercontinental belt, then goes back to Rockstar stuff. And now he's back with doing a thing with Omega again.
Yep.
So Jericho's kind of got this sort of non-WWE part-time pro wrestler thing kind of figured out right now.
Yeah, and it's probably the most advantageous thing he could possibly do. He's I wouldn't say he's equally known for music and wrestling, but it's probably close at this point.
And his podcast is hugely successful.
Yeah,
so.
And he gets to do everything he's known for simultaneously to maximum effectiveness.
Yep.
And with a maximum degree of creative freedom.
And a minimum amount of sort of physical mileage. He's going to be 48.
Yeah, it's the key here.
And so he gets to do wrestling, but he gets to do a match and then not do anything for a few months.
Right.
So it means a couple things. One, he's not taking the constant pounding.
Yep.
And two, he can go all in, so to speak, in a given match, meaning he can just go 100%, take risks, beat his body up a little bit, because he knows he doesn't have to be back in the ring the next day.
Yeah, he's not doing it 300 days a year.
No, he's gonna do this match and be a little sore, but then he gets months to recover.
Yep.
So he's kind of he's got a good thing going right now. Okay, so the second to last match was another sort of it's not really indie wrestling. New Japan's not really indie wrestling, but one of the darlings of New Japan wrestling, Kazuchika Okada, defeated another wrestler named Marty Scurll. Scurll's mostly a Ring of Honor guy.
Yeah.
So Okada's really good. He's among my favorites. He's not like top 10, but he's good. The only thing with this match is they encourage them to not be too strict on their time limit in order to get all their stuff in. But in their mission to not be too strict, they went like 12 minutes long in their slot. And we'll talk about in a little bit why that was kind of not a great thing to happen to the overall show. I guess the match was okay.
Right.
I did not see this match.
It's probably twice as long as it needed to be.
Well, exactly. I mean, it's clocked here at 26:05.
Yeah.
I mean, that's kind of absurd for a match that's not gimmicked in some way. It's not for a championship. It's not a last man standing or a marathon match or anything like that.
It's not with, perceptually the most important participants on the card.
Right.
So it's very surprising that match would go that long.
So the length of that match made the main event have to they were forced to squeeze in their match on like a 12-minute time limit when they were planning to go over 20.
Yep.
And this was a 6-man tag. It was the Golden Elite, which is Matt Jackson and Nick Jackson, with Kota Ibushi. Kota Ibushi is hugely over in Japan. Matt and Nick Jackson are the Young Bucks, and they are a tag team that's also hugely over pretty much in any organization, but again, not the WWE.
Right.
And
primarily based in Ring of Honor, right?
Yeah, I see a lot of them in Japan, though.
Yeah.
Anytime I watch New Japan on Access, they're just about any time they're there.
Yeah.
And they defeated a team of Rey Mysterio, Rey Fenix, and Bandito. I'm not super familiar with Rey Fenix or Bandito, but of course Rey Mysterio has been a big-time star for a long time. He had a great, comic book Wolverine wrestling gear thing going on, which was really cool. And the match was good. It was a super busy match, as any Young Bucks match tends to be. And it's a 6-man tag, which means a lot's going on.
Right.
This is sort of the flippy, flying, acrobatic match of the night with these guys involved. And I'm sure, it's fine and everything, just an interesting choice as a main event.
Yeah. The logic I read about that went into making that decision was that Nick and Matt Jackson are the promoters, along with Cody.
Right.
And basically they felt that they wanted to put themselves in a position that if anything had to be cut short, their own match would be cut short so that everybody else could get their chance to shine.
I guess that's pretty selfless.
It's weird because on the surface you'd think, well, the promoters are booking themselves in the main event. What do we got, Kevin Nash all over again? But if you apply that logic, it kind of makes sense. You have to wear kind of two hats to look at it, like we said earlier.
Yeah. So overall, the show seems to be pretty good. Some things that I didn't necessarily care for. Some things I really liked.
Right.
And overall, obviously, it was a huge success. Not only did they sell out this huge building, which is a big deal, but I think the pay-per-view did pretty well as well.
Yeah.
And in terms of the wrestling community, it's made really big waves.
Oh, yeah. In terms of the ticket sales, essentially 30 seconds for 10,000 seats means that they probably could have sold much more than 10,000 seats.
They could have done a 20,000 seat arena.
Right. It doesn't necessarily mean that 20,000 would have sold out in a minute, but the kind of success that they did have, all it can do is make you wonder, and I'm sure it's doing the same thing for them. Well, what can we do next time? I can't believe how well this worked, that kind of thing.
Absolutely. And actually, Ring of Honor has a big show lined up in Madison Square Garden.
Yep.
Which, again, is a big deal because the WWF/WWE has a long-standing relationship with Madison Square Garden. Again, going back to the territory days, the Northeast was the WWF's territory, based in New York, based in Madison Square Garden. And I guess Vince McMahon tried to strong-arm them out.
Yeah, initially they were told no.
But now, ROH has this backing from Sinclair Media.
Yep.
And they have lawyers that are every bit as expensive as Vince McMahon's.
Right.
So they got their spot back.
If not more.
They get to do exactly. So they get to do Madison Square Garden, and by all accounts, that's sold out.
And
which is a really big deal.
Yeah, it's the first time a non-WWE/F wrestling show will be put on in Madison Square Garden in 60 years.
That's a crazy thing to think about.
It's insane, yeah. It's like my dad's whole life.
Like, I don't want ROH to sort of start thinking they can sell out 20,000 seats whenever they want.
Right.
But if they can do it on a consistent basis once a month or once every 3 months special events, it's going to be really interesting to see how that develops and if they're actually going to, because you would never have thought so early on.
Right.
If ROH is actually the thing that rises up and challenges the WWE, I think that would be really interesting. However, I think they need to be careful. I don't think they really have to challenge the WWE on their terms. Like,
right.
Do your own thing.
Yep.
Let the fans come for you, or let the fans come to you, I guess is what I'm trying to say.
I mean, that's, everybody remembers kind of the peak of WCW and the way it ended, but they forget that that's the way they kind of rose to their spot as well. They offered their own product, their own style, for a long time before, ever going head to head. I mean, they were the NWA until Turner Broadcasting bought the company and it became WCW in 1988. And it wasn't until 1995 that the first episode of Nitro aired. So,
right.
There was a big span of time there.
It was like, they were 10-year overnight sensations.
Yeah, exactly.
Type of situation.
Right.
It didn't come out of nowhere.
And, we can see, I think the exciting thing is, and the reason people sometimes get ahead of themselves with this, is that there's enough momentum now that people can see a potential path opening up. But as long as they don't try to sprint down that path, things will be, kind of for the best.
Right. All right, so we've been talking about wrestling. What would your pro wrestling Mount Rushmore look like? I think we basically agree.
Yeah, this is one of the classic wrestling questions. If you were to put, 4 wrestlers on your own Mount Rushmore of the all-time greats, who would you choose? And it comes down, I think...
there's a few factors that go into trying to figure out who it should be.
Yeah, there's kind of... You kind of almost have to have 2 separate Mount Rushmores. The main, like the industry, the undisputable industry Mount Rushmore of, most successful, most impactful household names, and a Mount Rushmore of probably your personal favorites.
Exactly, and that's what we've both done. There's also, like, when you're trying to decide who's a good wrestler, there's what they do in the ring, there's what they do with a microphone.
Yep.
There's, how well known are they to somebody who's not a wrestling fan?
Right.
There's not a ton of names that are that well known. No matter how well known you are as a wrestler, when you step out of the wrestling community, there's not a lot of people who have sort of grown beyond that limitation.
Yep, that narrows the herd real quick.
It sure does.
Yeah, so we pretty much agree on who the industry, the
sort of the objective Mount Rushmore of wrestling. I think we agree on at least 3 of them.
Yes.
So first off, we both agree on Hulk Hogan.
Naturally.
I mean, it's hard to overstate Hulkamania from the 80s.
Yeah, I mean that's the, like you said, we it grew with us, and that we kind of basically we all grew with Hulk Hogan.
Yeah.
We followed his trajectory.
And everybody knows who Hulk Hogan is.
Right.
The next one is an interesting case, actually. So we both have Ric Flair on the list. He's one that's probably less well known outside of wrestling than Hulk Hogan. He gained a lot of fame sort of late in his career.
Yep.
But I think he belongs. I'm confident. I'm comfortable with him being on there.
Well, Hulk, I think what it comes down to is most people would choose Hulk Hogan as the personality and choose Ric Flair as the wrestler.
I think that's fair enough. Yeah. The next one we both have on here is another interesting case, Steve Austin. Because nobody, over a certain period of time, nobody made more money. Nobody pulled in more money in terms of their merchandise, selling tickets, than Steve Austin did over a 5-year span.
Right.
But that 5 years is also the limit of his peak.
Right.
His entire sort of, his career goes back a long way, but he didn't have a name really. He was not significant in any way. Then he hit it big. Then his peak was 5 years, and he was gone.
His star burned hot, but it burned out quick.
That's what happens to the big ones.
Right.
But I think we agree. I mean, when you outsell Hulk Hogan in terms of merchandise and things like that, I think you belong on the list.
Yeah, for sure.
The fourth spot on Mount Rushmore, I have a bunch of names here, and I'm not sure who to pull off of the list and put on the mountain. Do you have a definitive fourth selection?
Well, we've discussed before, and I think the fourth one comes down to what kind of prism you're viewing it through. In terms of sheer, impact outside of wrestling and household name recognition, it would have to be The Rock.
Absolutely. Yep.
However, in terms of, career longevity and the fact that, as we discussed before, that The Rock is probably a little more well-known at this point for acting than he is for wrestling.
Right.
You start to kind of have to consider some of the other, I guess, pure wrestlers, or at least more wrestling-oriented.
Right. So the names that I have here, Andre the Giant.
Naturally.
And again, we're a little bit further separated from his peak, but he was a big deal. Randy Savage, Macho Man, because he's another household name, thanks in no small part to the Slim Jim ads.
Right.
Undertaker.
Yep.
Because he's had a super long career and everybody knows who the Undertaker is. I also have Shawn Michaels and Chris Jericho on here.
Yeah.
I think Chris Jericho probably the first to go, although he's developing quite a legacy for himself in terms of longevity.
Yeah, he sure is.
And fame and success outside of wrestling. Shawn Michaels is largely considered sort of the best in-ring worker.
Mm-hmm.
But he doesn't have a lot of notoriety outside of wrestling.
Right.
So he probably gets off the list too.
Well, there's one more that I think has to be in the conversation, whether I like it or not necessarily. But at this point, I think you have to also include John Cena.
Yeah. Yep.
Yeah.
It's similar to Hogan. I mean, in-ring talent maybe not the best, but he's gained a lot of notoriety for other reasons. I mean, he's done a lot of weird, a lot of guest starring roles in movies and TV.
Yep.
He's done like morning news show hosting gigs.
Yeah.
Of course, he does the Make-A-Wish stuff, which he's developed quite a reputation for that.
Right.
So I think you're right. I think he deserves consideration.
Yeah, it's weird to think that, you said Andre's on the list. He's kind of the original Rock. I mean, he kind of branched out into acting from wrestling before any of them did.
Andre?
Yeah. The Princess Bride was before any of Hogan's movies.
Wow. Huh. I didn't think about that.
Unless you count Rocky 3, but Hogan was still with the AWA at that point.
Right.
So it wasn't the era of Hulkamania yet.
Yeah, there's big stories about him and Vern Gagne getting into it about that Rocky thing. Yeah, that's interesting. So we have to decide here. We've got Hogan, Ric Flair, and Steve Austin.
I don't know.
I think we can take Randy Savage off. I think, as much as I like him, I think he's off. I'm taking Undertaker off. I think it comes down to The Rock and Andre. I know you just added John Cena. I don't know if...
yeah, I mean, he's in the conversation, but
yeah.
I don't know if he makes the list. It just comes down to if you want to respect the business, you go with Andre, or if you want to, go with market saturation, you got to go with Dwayne Johnson.
I think I'm going Rock.
I'm going to say you go with either based on how you look at it.
Well, I'm making a choice.
So by default, The Rock wins.
I'm making a choice. I'm going Rock. I'm going Rock on that one. So Hulk Hogan, Ric Flair, Steve Austin, The Rock.
Yeah.
All-time Mount Rushmore.
It's probably fair.
Okay. Now we can talk about our individual picks.
And they're going to vary wildly.
Maybe. Again, we're trying to limit it to 4, and I've got 5 names. I've got Hulk Hogan because I cannot escape the effect he had on me as a child.
Right.
He was just such a big deal. I've got Bret Hart because I've never seen a match that wasn't good. I like his look, the pink and the black. I like everything about what Bret Hart did.
Same.
Randy Savage because, again, his in-ring work was great, his look was great, and he was a maniac with a microphone.
Yep.
And then the 4th spot, I got 2 guys here, Undertaker and Kurt Angle.
It's fair.
Undertaker, obviously, hugely long career, very iconic character. And Kurt Angle just really put it together. I mean, to come from such a legitimate sports background, legitimate Olympic gold medalist.
Right.
And as a wrestler, he was great. Great with a microphone, great in the ring. He was like the full package.
Yep.
So it's hard for me to decide on that last one. So before I make my decision, I will hand the ball to you to go over what your list looks like.
Well, mine are fairly defined. I mean, I guess I can kind of, depending on the day and whose work I'm into more at the time, kind of vacillate a little bit.
Absolutely.
But I'm pretty confident in going with choosing Bret Hart as well. My all-time favorite wrestler overall. Right behind him, right on his coattails, would be the man called Sting. Which is funny because they both have the same finishing move, and they both had I don't know, kind of interesting connections throughout the years, and even some great matches against each other when Bret Hart finally came over to WCW.
Right.
But number 3 is, of course, I have to have Hulk Hogan / Hollywood Hogan, because you can't, you can focus on what everybody knows Hulk Hogan for is his rise to prominence through Hulkamania and Rock and Wrestling in the 80s and into the early 90s as the red and yellow superstar. But this is a guy who had arguably an equally successful run right after that as a villain.
And one of the most sort of surprising, drastic character turns there ever was. Yeah, it's hard to it's easy to overlook, I guess, but it shouldn't be overlooked.
Right. So I think that all goes into the pot to solidify his place. And for me, the number 4 spot is going to go to Mr. Perfect, Kurt Hennig.
Perfectly deserving.
He was never a world champion anywhere. He was never, well, I think he might have been in his early days in regional organizations, but never on a main TV organization was a world champion. He was never, necessarily a household name. He was a star. He was a legitimate star. He was a top 3 worker. Almost anybody who's ever been in the business will tell you that. And his charisma and his ability, his physical and even cerebral, I guess, on the microphone, and his quick wit, and he was the Mr. Perfect gimmick because he was legitimately great in just about anything he ever tried. I'll never forget one of my early wrestling memories. I've told the story. I don't know if I've done it on the podcast, but I've told it to people a million times. I'll never forget watching Double Dare. They had wrestlers guesting on the show, and Mr. Perfect obviously was one of them. I can't remember who he was against, but it was like a wrestler and a kid teaming up, and they had these physical challenges, and one of them was you had to have a little cup attached to the top of your head, and your teammate had to throw something in the cup. I don't know what it was, balls or something.
Right.
And, whoever caught the most won. And wouldn't you know it, Mr. Perfect caught every single goddamn one of them. And I was probably 6 or 7 watching this, and I exclaimed out loud, "He really is perfect." I couldn't believe it.
Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Mark Summers, and welcome to the most excitingly sloppy event in wrestling history. It's Super Slopomania 2. Things have gotten somewhat out of hand here between Hacksaw Jim and Mr. Perfect. What gives, guys? Gentlemen, there's only one way to settle this.
You don't mean...
That's right, a super sloppy Hawaiian ring toss. On your mark. Get set. Go! Toss those over there.
These wrestling teams have gone wicky-wacky as they hit the ropes with our Hawaiian ring toss. Whichever one rings them first will slop on $20 in control of the show, where Wrestling with Mess will bring on the dough.
Come on up here. Let's play some Super Sloppy Double Dare.
Super Sloppy Double Dare.
And that stuck with me all these years later.
That's a fine choice. I mean, he's definitely in my top 6 or 7 for sure. By the way, I'm going Kurt Angle.
Kurt Angle clinches it.
Yep. So I've got Hogan, Bret Hart, Randy Savage, Kurt Angle.
I mean, you'd be hard-pressed to find an argument with that selection.
Yours either. I mean, I think the weakest of the bunch in terms of their work is probably Sting.
Yeah.
I mean, Hogan always, but I mean, there's a different thing with Hogan going on.
Right.
But Sting was perfectly capable and competent.
Yeah.
And I know you just really liked his character and everything. And there's nothing wrong. Sting is on my list somewhere up higher.
Well, he's another one too where, I mean, it's not quite like Hogan, but he had more, but essentially two very defined, very distinct, but very successful periods of his career. And it could have gone horribly wrong.
Yeah.
But I mean, he was a huge successful star as, a Hulk Hogan-esque, kind of very
or heroic,
family friendly, very colorful babyface character throughout the late 80s and into the 90s. And then as the mid 90s came, completely lost, like the complete opposite, just like Hogan, the devoid of all color and speaking and no personality, and was hotter than ever.
Right. Yeah. Yep. Absolutely. So there's our Mount Rushmores and our experience with wrestling, and it'll continue. I'm interested to see what happens with these sort of independent organizations and if they can actually make something out of this groundswell that we're seeing.
Right.
It's going to be interesting to watch.
It's absolutely a very exciting time to be a fan of wrestling. And it's shaping up to potentially be the most exciting time since, the heyday in the 90s.
I agree.
Well, I believe that brings us to the end of our all wrestling episode. For Just Jamie, I have been your friend Claude, and we will see you at the matches.
Later, brother.
The N.E.R.D.Bomber podcast is a Ghost Factory internet production brought to you by the WAM Network.